The iron-colored sky of Xylo's prime hung like a rusted veil over the desolation below. Perpetual smog, thick with metal particulates and industrial waste, cast everything in a dull amber haze. The world beneath this toxic canopy was little more than a massive industrial complex of refineries, processing plants, and worker hovels, all connected by a labyrinthine network of pipes and narrow walkways. Toxic rain left caustic streaks down the sides of buildings, and the incessant drone of machinery provided the planet's heartbeat. In the outermost ring of this industrial hell, where waste flowed freely and hope had long since evaporated, the forgotten and discarded congregated. Some were former workers whose bodies had failed them, others fugitives from various authorities, and many were slaves who had outlived their usefulness or managed to escape their masters. Here, in one of the many disposal zones where industrial sludge collected in shallow, poisonous pools, something stirred in the muck. At first glance, it might have been mistaken for a pile of sodden rags or industrial debris. But there was movement, subtle, nearly imperceptible twitches that betrayed life. It was a human form, so thoroughly coated in layers of dark, viscous mud that gender, age, and even species were impossible to discern. Only the occasional blink of eyes, twin gleams in a mask of filth, confirmed that whatever lay beneath the crusted layers of industrial waste was still alive. The creature, for that was how most inhabitants of Xylos would regard such a pitiful specimen, had no name, at least none that mattered anymore. In the rare moments when coherent thought pushed through the fog of bare survival, the being thought of itself simply as it, or sometimes the mud thing, adopting the cruel designations that had been spat at it by passers-by. Memories existed in fragments, shards of a shattered past that cut when examined too closely. Hands that had once been gentle turning violent, a voice that had once offered comfort, now commanding obedience, pain delivered as lessons, and eventually disposal, like every other piece of broken equipment on Xylo's prime. Survival had become purely instinctual. It scavenged at night, hiding during the day. It drank collected rainwater despite the burning sensation it caused in its throat. It curled into tight spaces when the slave hunters' drones passed overhead, their scanning beams sweeping the disposal zones. The layer of industrial sludge that covered its body had started as a desperate attempt at camouflage, but had, over time, become a second skin, a barrier between the vulnerable flesh beneath and the hostile world around it. Today, it had found a relatively dry depression between two massive disposal pipes, a space just large enough to curl up in. From this vantage, it could observe one of the maintenance routes where occasionally individual workers would pass, rather than the usual crowds. Sometimes these solitary figures dropped things, food scraps, broken tools, pieces of fabric, that could mean the difference between life and death in the disposal zone. One particular figure had caught its attention over the past weeks. A man who moved differently from the others, not with the plodding gait of exhausted laborers or the predatory stride of overseers, but with purpose and awareness. He came at odd intervals, carrying salvaged parts and tools, and always seemed to be watching the shadows. Several times, it had felt the man's gaze linger near its hiding place, though the mud camouflage had thus far proven effective. The man was tall with broad shoulders that seemed perpetually tensed, as if expecting a blow from behind. His face was largely obscured by a respiratory filter and protective goggles, standard equipment for anyone with access to such luxuries on Xylos. What little could be seen of his features suggested hardship, a jagged scar cutting across his left cheek, disappearing beneath his filter mask, and cropped dark hair peppered with premature gray. He wore the patched and modified clothing of a free worker, not the uniform coveralls of company employees or the rags of slaves. It knew it should fear this man as it feared all beings on Xylos, but something in his movements, a certain carefulness, a hesitation when passing the disposal areas, sparked a dangerous feeling. Not hope, for hope had been beaten out of it long ago, but perhaps curiosity. Today, the man had passed by earlier than usual, his arms laden with a collection of salvaged power cells. He had paused briefly near the disposal zone, his goggled gaze scanning the area, before continuing on his way. The sudden wail of a klaxon shattered the relative quiet. Emergency alarms were not uncommon on Xylos, usually signaling chemical spills or structural failures, but this particular alarm had a different cadence, 3 short blasts followed by 1 long. The signal for an imminent acid rain event. These downpours, created by the interaction of industrial pollutants with the planet's destabilized atmosphere, could dissolve exposed flesh in minutes. Panic surged through the mud thing's veins. Its current shelter offered no protection from the coming rain. It needed to move to find better cover, but daylight movement increased the risk of detection. As it hesitated, paralyzed by competing survival instincts, the distant sound of voices cut through the alarm's wail. 3 figures were approaching the disposal zone, their silhouettes unmistakable, slave hunters, likely hoping to catch fugitives in the open as they fled the coming acid rain. It pressed itself deeper into its hiding spot, knowing it was inadequate against both threats but having nowhere else to go. The familiar numbness began to spread through its limbs, the body's final mercy, preparing itself for the pain to come. The acid rain began with a hiss, individual droplets striking metal surfaces with tiny plumes of steam. The slave hunters quickened their pace, unfolding protective hoods from their collars. They were less than 50 meters away now, scanning methodically with handheld detectors. Soon they would be close enough to spot the depression where it hid, and then a sudden movement from another direction caught its attention. The tall man had returned, moving quickly along the maintenance path. But instead of continuing past, he veered unexpectedly toward the disposal zone, toward its hiding place. In one fluid motion, the man unfastened a tarp-like material from his pack and flung it outward. The synthetic sheet unfurled and settled over the depression where the mud thing huddled, creating a makeshift shelter just as the acid rain began to fall in earnest. Confusion flooded its mind. The man had seen it. Known it was there. Yet instead of alerting the approaching slave hunters, he had provided protection. Such an act was so far outside its understanding of Xylos that for a moment it wondered if this was some new form of cruelty, protection offered only to be snatched away at the last moment, a final torment before capture. Through a small gap in the tarp, it watched as the man produced something else from his pack, a small, cylindrical object that he activated with a twist. He tossed it in the opposite direction, where it landed with a clatter and immediately began emitting a high-pitched whine and a series of erratic lights. The slave hunters, now shielding themselves from the intensifying rain, turned toward the distraction. The man didn't wait to see if his diversion worked. He knelt beside the tarp, his voice barely audible over the hissing rain. "Stay still. When they're gone, we move." The words took several seconds to process, not just their meaning, but the tone. There was no command in that voice, no threat. It was low, steady, and offered something the mud thing had not encountered in longer than it could remember: choice. For 10 agonizing minutes, it remained motionless under the tarp as the acid rain intensified, each droplet that struck the protective covering producing a soft sizzle. Through the gap, it could see the slave hunters investigating the decoy device, the frustration evident even at a distance. Eventually, with the rain showing no signs of abating, they retreated, disappearing back toward the relative safety of the industrial complexes. The man waited another full minute before speaking again. "They'll be back when the rain stops. We have a window now." He lifted one edge of the tarp, careful to ensure no acid rain slipped through. "I have shelter. You can come or stay. Your choice." Choice. The concept was almost as foreign as kindness on Xylos. It struggled to comprehend what was being offered and why. Every instinct screamed danger, a trap, inevitable betrayal. Yet some long-dormant part of itself, perhaps the last fragment of who it had been before becoming the mud thing, recognized this moment for what it was, possibly the final chance to be something other than prey. With trembling limbs caked in hardened sludge, it crawled toward the opening the man had created. As it emerged, The man quickly rewrapped the protective tarp around its hunched form, creating a barrier against both the rain and prying eyes. "Keep your head down," he instructed, his voice still curiously devoid of the harshness that characterized all interactions on Xylos. "Walk where I walk. Stop when I stop." They moved quickly but carefully through the disposal zone, the man leading them along a path that offered maximum cover from surveillance drones and minimal exposure to the acid rain. Other desperate figures could be seen huddled in whatever shelter they'd managed to find, their gazes following the unlikely pair with a mixture of confusion and envy. None made any move to interfere. Survival on Xylos demanded minding one's own business. The journey felt endless. Each step was an agony of fear and anticipation, waiting for the moment when the man would reveal his true intentions, when kindness would revert to cruelty as it always had before. But that moment never came. Instead, after navigating a complex series of maintenance corridors, ventilation ducts, and abandoned processing tunnels, they arrived at what appeared to be a sealed maintenance shaft, one of many that honeycombed the industrial landscape of Xylos. The man approached a control panel that seemed long dead, its display cracked and dark. With practiced movements, he manipulated something behind the panel, and a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow passage beyond. "Inside," he said, glancing back over his shoulder to ensure they hadn't been followed. Quickly, the passage led to a space that defied all expectations. What had once been an automated maintenance hub had been transformed into a living space that, while Spartan, possessed an order and cleanliness that seemed impossible on Xylos. The main chamber was circular, perhaps 10 meters in diameter, with a domed ceiling from which hung an array of salvaged and repaired lighting elements that cast a warm, steady glow throughout the space. The walls were lined with shelving units containing neatly organized tools, components, and supplies. A workbench dominated one side of the room, covered with half-completed projects and diagnostic equipment. A narrow corridor led off to what appeared to be additional rooms. The man secured the entrance behind them and began removing his outer protective gear. First the goggles, then the respiratory filter, revealing the full extent of the scar that bisected his left cheek, continuing up to his temple. His eyes were a startling shade of gray, like the sky of a world the mud thing could barely remember. "My name is Kale," he said, hanging his gear on hooks near the entrance. "This is my home. You're safe here for now." He paused, studying the mud-encrusted figure before him. "Can you understand me?" It managed a small nod, the dried mud on its face cracking slightly with the movement. Kale seemed to release a breath he'd been holding. "Good. That's good." He moved toward what appeared to be a small kitchenette area. "You must be thirsty. Hungry too, I guess." The mention of sustenance sent an involuntary tremor through its body. Kale noticed and nodded, interpreting the response correctly. He retrieved a container of water, clear water, not the brownish liquid that collected in the disposal zones, and a package of what appeared to be basic protein rations. He set both on a small table near the center of the room. "Eat. Drink," he said, then added, "when you're ready." He took a deliberate step back, giving space. "After that, you might want to get clean. I have water for washing, recycled, but clean, and some old clothes that might fit." He gestured toward the corridor. "There's a washroom through there. First door. I'll stay out here." It remained frozen, unable to process the situation. Food, water, shelter, the offer of cleanliness. These things came with prices on Xylos, terrible prices it had paid before. Yet Kale was making no demands, applying no pressure. He had moved to his workbench and was deliberately focusing on some project there, his back half-turned, a gesture that on Xylos was either profound trust or supreme confidence. Minutes passed before hunger and thirst overcame fear. It approached the table cautiously, expecting at any moment for the trap to spring. When nothing happened, it quickly grabbed the water container, drinking deeply. The sensation of clean water, water that didn't burn or taste the chemicals, was so overwhelming that a sound escaped its throat, something between a sob and a sigh. Kale didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed slightly at the sound. "There's more when you finish that," he said quietly. The protein rations were plain but fresh, not the expired or salvaged scraps it had subsisted on. It ate quickly, animal-like, expecting the food to be snatched away at any moment. When both water and food were consumed, it stood uncertainly, gaze fixed on the corridor Kale had indicated. "Washroom's all yours," Kale said, still focused on his work. "There's a lock on the inside of the door. Soap and cleansers are in the cabinets. Towels on the rack. Take your time." The idea of voluntarily removing the protective layer of mud was terrifying. The filth had been both disguise and armor for so long that existing without it seemed impossible. Yet the thought of clean water against skin, of removing the weight and stench of the industrial sludge, awakened a longing it hadn't realized still existed. The washroom was small, but, like the rest of Kale's home, meticulously maintained. A recycling shower unit stood in one corner, a luxury beyond imagination in the disposal zones. Containers of various cleansers lined a shelf, and as promised, several worn but clean towels hung from a rack on the wall. Most importantly, the door had a functioning lock, a guarantee of privacy that it immediately engaged. For several minutes, it simply stood in the center of the washroom, trembling. Then, slowly, it began to peel away the outermost layers of filth-encrusted rags that had once been clothing. The material had fused with the mud in places, requiring painful tugging to separate from the skin beneath. As each layer came away, memories surfaced, fragments of a time when it had worn actual clothes, when it had possessed a name and an identity beyond merely surviving. Naked now, but still coated in a thick layer of dried industrial sludge, it approached the shower unit with trepidation. Following simple pictographic instructions on the control panel, it activated the water flow. Warm water, another forgotten luxury, cascaded down, and it stepped beneath the stream. The initial contact of water with the hardened mud created a startling transformation. Dark rivulets streamed downward, swirling into the drain below. It stood motionless, watching as the outer layers of its protection and prison began to dissolve. The process was physically painful. The mud had adhered to wounds both old and new, and its removal reopened some while revealing others that had healed poorly. The first tentative touch of the soap against newly exposed skin sent a shudder through its entire body. The sensation was almost too intense to bear, yet it continued, driven by an awakening desire to rediscover what lay beneath the filth. Gradually, methodically, it began to scrub away years of accumulated grime. As the mud receded, something extraordinary was revealed. Beneath the layers of industrial waste, its skin bore intricate patterns, pale, blue, bioluminescent markings that traced delicate whorls and spirals across its shoulders, down its spine, and along its arms and legs. These patterns, dormant and hidden for so long, began to emit a soft, ethereal glow in response to the stimulation of being uncovered. The sight of these markings reflected in the small mirror above the wash basin provoked a surge of conflicting emotions. Recognition. Yes, this had once been familiar. This had been part of its identity. Fear. These marks were why it had been hunted, captured, enslaved. And something else, something that felt dangerously like hope, a confirmation that beneath the mud thing, a person still existed. With trembling fingers, it touched the glowing patterns, triggering a brighter pulse of bioluminescence in response. The face that stared back from the mirror was gaunt, marked with old scars and new abrasions, but undeniably feminine. Silver-white hair, now free of mud, clung to her scalp in irregular patches where it had been roughly cut or torn out. She, not it, she. The realization crashed over her like a wave, dissolving the last of the barriers she had erected around her sense of self. She sank to the floor of the shower, arms wrapped around her knees, as the water continued to wash away the physical evidence of her degradation. For the first time in years, she wept, not from pain or fear, but from the overwhelming experience of reclaiming some fragment of her humanity. How long she remained there, she couldn't say. Eventually, the water automatically shut off, a conservation measure typical on resource-limited silos. She rose shakily and reached for one of the towels, wrapping it around her emaciated form. As the fabric touched her skin, the bioluminescent patterns brightened momentarily before settling into a steady, soft glow. On the counter near the wash basin, Kale had left a stack of clothing as promised. Simple garments, worn but clean. She dressed slowly, relearning the sensation of fabric against clean skin. The clothes hung loosely on her frame, emphasizing how much her body had withered during her time in the disposal zones. Despite this, the act of dressing in actual clothing rather than layers of rags and filth felt like a reclamation of dignity. When she finally emerged from the washroom, she found Kale still at his workbench, deliberately focused on disassembling some piece of salvage technology. He didn't immediately turn to look at her, another gesture that she recognized as intentional, giving her time to adjust to approach on her own terms. "There's more food if you're still hungry," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "And the cot in the back room is made up if you need a rest." She remained in the doorway, uncertain. Her instincts, honed by years of survival in a world where every interaction was a potential threat, screamed at her to be wary of such generosity. Yet those same instincts had recognized something in Kale from the first moment she'd observed him from her hiding place. A similar wariness, a similar guardedness. He too was someone who had learned to navigate Xylos by keeping to the shadows. "What?" The word emerged as little more than a croak, her vocal cords rusty from disuse. Kale finally turned to face her, his expression carefully controlled as he took in her transformed appearance. If the bioluminescent markings surprised him, he gave no indication. His gaze remained fixed on her face, respectful in a way she had forgotten was possible. "Why what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he understood the question perfectly. "Why help me?" Her voice gained a little strength with use. Kale was quiet for a long moment, considering his response. "Because no one helped me when I needed it," he finally said. "And because on Xylos, we're all just one bad day away from the disposal zones." It wasn't a complete answer, but it was honest. She could sense that much. There was a history behind those words, a wound that had never properly healed. She recognized it because she carried similar wounds. "You can stay as long as you need to," Kale continued, "or leave when you want. Like I said before, your choice." That word again. Choice. It had been so long since choices were hers to make that the concept still felt dangerously foreign. But standing there, clean, clothed, and addressed as a person rather than property, she made her first real decision in years. "I'll stay." The words were barely audible, but Kale nodded, acknowledging both her decision and the courage it had taken to make it. "Do you have a name?" he asked after a moment. "Something you want to be called?" Did she? The question triggered a cascade of fragmented memories, a name spoken with affection, then later shouted in anger, then whispered in fear, and finally, not spoken at all as she became merely slave or property, or her true name felt like it belonged to someone else now, someone who had died the day she was captured. Yet some part of it still resonated, still felt like hers to reclaim. "Lyra," she said, the name feeling strange on her tongue after so long. "My name is Lyra." Kale nodded, a simple acknowledgement that carried the weight of recognition. "Lyra," he repeated, and in his voice, the name sounded like a possibility rather than a remnant of the past. "Welcome to my home, Lyra, for however long you choose to stay." The first days in Kale's sanctuary passed in near silence. Lyra spent much of her time sleeping, deep, healing sleep unmarred by the constant vigilance required in the disposal zones. When awake, she observed Kale from a distance as he worked on his various projects, repairing salvage technology or building new devices from scavenged components. His movements were precise, methodical, suggesting formal training rather than self-taught skills. Kale maintained a respectful distance, never approaching her directly or making sudden movements that might trigger fear. He spoke little, but ensured she had access to everything she needed: food, water, clean clothes, basic medical supplies for the wounds revealed during her cleansing. He never commented on her bioluminescent markings, though she occasionally caught him studying them with curious eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. On the third day, Lyra ventured closer to his workbench, drawn by curiosity about a device he was assembling. It appeared to be a sensor array of some kind, with components she recognized from her life before Xylos. Kale noticed her interest, but continued working without comment, his hands steady as he soldered delicate connections. "It's a multi-spectrum scanner," she said suddenly, surprising both of them with the observation. Kale looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing his features before he controlled it. "Yes," he confirmed, "though not a very good one yet. The focusing element is damaged." Lyra hesitated, then pointed to a particular component. "That's installed backward. The ion flow needs to move in the opposite direction for proper calibration." Now Kale's surprise was evident. He examined the component, then looked back at her with new assessment in his eyes. "You're right," he said, making the adjustment. "You know scanner technology?" A shadow crossed her face as memories threatened to surface. Before. Yes." Kale nodded, understanding the unspoken boundaries of the conversation. "Would you like to help?" he asked, indicating the workbench. "No pressure, just an offer. Another choice." Lyra considered for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Kale shifted slightly to make room for her at the bench, and together they worked on the scanner in companionable silence. Her movements were tentative at first, her hands remembering skills that her conscious mind had partly suppressed. But soon the familiar tasks absorbed her attention, providing a momentary escape from the weight of her past. This established a new pattern to their days. Lyra began to help with small tasks around Kale's sanctuary, organizing tools, preparing simple meals from their limited supplies, eventually assisting with more complex repairs. The work provided structure and purpose, something she had been denied for years. In turn, Kale began to share more about the systems that kept his hiding place functioning. The water recyclers, air filtration, power generation, and the intricate security measures that had kept him undetected. They still spoke little, communicating primarily through gestures and brief exchanges focused on immediate tasks. But the silences became less tense, more comfortable, as a fragile trust began to take root between them. On the seventh night, the sanctuary's power system experienced a sudden failure. Lyra was jolted from sleep by the disorienting absence of the soft hum that had become a constant backdrop. In the pitch darkness, panic seized her. Was this an attack? Had they been discovered? A soft blue glow emanated from her skin as her bioluminescent markings brightened in response to her fear. The ethereal light revealed Kale already moving toward the main control panel, his expression focused rather than alarmed. "Power converter overloaded," he explained, his voice steady. "Been expecting it for weeks. Got a backup, but need to install it before our air filtration fails." The word "our" registered faintly through Lyra's anxiety, a small acknowledgement of her place in this shared space. Drawing a deep breath, she forced the panic down and moved to help, her natural illumination providing enough light for them to work by. "Hand me the fusion wrench," Kale requested, and Lyra complied, her movements growing more confident as they fell into a rhythm of cooperation. For nearly an hour they worked side by side, replacing the damaged converter and rerouting power through secondary systems until the main lights flickered back to life. As the crisis passed, Lyra became acutely aware of how close they'd been standing, how naturally they'd worked together without fear or hesitation. The realization startled her. When had she begun to trust this man enough to stand within arm's reach, to turn her back to him, to believe his explanation of the power failure rather than assuming betrayal? Kale seemed to read her thoughts. "You're safe here, Lyra," he said quietly. "I know that's hard to believe on Xylos, but it's true." She looked at him directly, searching his face for any sign of deception. "Why did you really help me?" she asked, the question that had lingered since that first day. Kale was silent for a long moment. Then he gestured toward the small sitting area where they occasionally shared meals. "That's a longer conversation. Are you ready for it?" Lyra considered, then nodded. They settled across from each other, the small recycled metal table between them. Kale stared into his cup of synthetic tea, gathering his thoughts. "I was military once," he began. "Federation Special Operations. came to Xylos with a team, officially to inspect compliance with interplanetary labor conventions, unofficially to investigate rumors of illegal genetic experimentation and bioweapon development. He touched the scar on his face unconsciously. We were betrayed. Someone in Federation Command sold us out to the corporations that run this hellhole. My team was ambushed. I was the only survivor, and even though it was luck more than skill, a structural collapse separated me from the others during the firefight. Kale's eyes held a distant look, revisiting memories Lyra recognized all too well. I couldn't contact Command. All channels were being monitored. Couldn't leave the planet. Every port was watching for me. So I disappeared into Xylos instead. Built this place. Learned to survive. How long? Lyra asked softly. 6 years, for months, 17 days. Kale answered without hesitation. I kept trying to find a way off planet at first. Then I discovered something worse than being stranded. I learned why we were betrayed. He looked at her directly now, his gaze lingering briefly on the luminescent patterns visible at her neckline. The corporations here aren't just exploiting cheap labor. They're experimenting with genetic modifications, trying to create workers adapted to toxic environments or enhanced for specific industrial tasks. And they're targeting specific populations for these experiments. Lyra's markings pulsed brighter with sudden emotion. People like me. Kale nodded. The Lycian. Your bioluminescence is naturally occurring, evolved on your home world as a response to the low-light conditions. But the corporations discovered that your genetic structure is uniquely adaptable. They've been abducting Lycians for years, using them as test subjects. The confirmation of what she had suspected but never fully known sent a wave of nausea through Lyra. Her people, peaceful, technologically advanced, but culturally private, had been targeted specifically for their biological uniqueness. I was a researcher, she said, her voice hollow with remembered pain. Xenobiology. I came to Xylos Prime to study the unique fungal adaptations in the southern continent. My credentials were proper, my permits in order. But none of that mattered. They took me from my research outpost. Use me as. You don't have to say it, Kale said. Gently. I've seen the labs. I know what they do there. Tears slid down Lyra's cheeks, illuminated with the same pale blue glow as her markings. I escaped during a power failure similar to the one tonight. But they'd already changed things inside me. The luminescence patterns are stronger now, responsive to emotional states. They used to be purely voluntary. She swallowed hard. I cover myself in mud because scanners can detect the unique radiation signature of Lycian bioluminescence. I became nothing so I could survive. Kale's expression hardened. You became a survivor. There's a difference. They sat in silence for several minutes, each absorbing the other's confession. Finally, Kale spoke again. I help people when I can, get them off planet, provide temporary shelter, medical care. Small resistance against a system too big to fight directly. But resources are limited, and trust is dangerous. He met her eyes. When I first saw you in the disposal zone, I almost walked past. Self-preservation is a hard habit to break on Xylos. But there was something in the way you hid, too careful, too deliberate for someone who had surrendered to their fate. I recognized it because I do the same things. And now, Lyra asked, the question encompassing everything that had happened since and everything that might come next. Now we have choices, Kale said, echoing what had become something of a mantra between them. You can stay here, help me with my work. It's not much of a life, but it's safer than most get on this planet. Or if you want to leave Xylos, I have contacts, not entirely trustworthy, but sometimes effective. It would be dangerous, especially for a Lycian, but possible. What about you? Lyra asked. Don't you want to leave? A complex emotion crossed Kale's face. Sometimes, but there's still work to do here. People to help. Information to gather about what the corporations are really doing. Maybe someday, I'll find a way to expose it all, force the Federation to acknowledge their complicity. The conviction in his voice resonated with something long dormant in Lyra, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. She had been a researcher once, dedicated to understanding and knowledge. That part of her identity had been buried beneath layers of trauma and fear, but it wasn't completely gone. "I want to stay," she said, the decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Not just hide. Help. Like you helped me." For the first time since she'd known him, Kale smiled. A small, tentative expression that transformed his face, softening the hardness that Xylos had carved into his features. "It won't be easy or safe," he warned. "Nothing on Xylos is," Lyra replied, her own lips curving slightly in response. "But maybe together, we can make it a little less terrible for someone else." That conversation marked a turning point. The tentative trust between them solidified into something approaching partnership. Kale began sharing more about his covert operations, the network of informants he'd cultivated, the evidence he'd been gathering about corporate atrocities, his occasional success in helping others escape Xylos. Lyra, in turn, offered her scientific knowledge, helping him understand the genetic research she had glimpsed during her captivity. As weeks passed, Lyra's strength returned. Proper nutrition and safety allowed her body to recover from years of deprivation, though some scars, both physical and psychological, would never fully heal. She began accompanying Kale on cautious excursions outside their sanctuary, always heavily disguised, learning the secret passages and blind spots in Xylos' surveillance systems. On one such excursion, they encountered a young worker collapsed in an unused maintenance tunnel, suffering from acute toxin exposure, a common affliction on Xylos. Without hesitation, Lyra knelt beside the stranger, checking vitals with practiced movements that spoke of her scientific background. Together, she and Kale managed to stabilize the worker and bring them back to their sanctuary for treatment. As they tended to the unconscious patient, Kale observed Lyra with new appreciation. "You've done this before," he noted. "More than basic first aid." Lyra nodded, administering a detoxification compound she had helped synthesize from available materials. "My research frequently took me to remote locations. Medical training was required." A shadow crossed her face. "Later, in the labs, I learned more than I wanted to about how bodies respond to trauma." Kale placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, the first deliberate physical contact he'd initiated between them. "You're using that knowledge to heal now. That matters." The simple touch and words of affirmation affected Lyra more deeply than she'd expected. Her markings pulsed with sudden emotion, casting the room in soft blue light. She didn't pull away from his hand. Their patient recovered over the next few days and eventually left with supplies and directions to a relatively safe settlement in the outer industrial ring. This became another aspect of their shared work, providing temporary refuge to those in desperate circumstances, using Lyra's scientific knowledge and Kale's tactical skills to offer what help they could in a world designed to crush compassion. During the quiet hours between crises and missions, they began to share more of themselves with each other. Kale spoke of his homeworld, a coastal community on Talos 4, where he'd grown up swimming in crystalline waters and dreaming of the stars. His path to military service had been motivated by idealism, a belief in the Federation's stated principles of justice and protection for all sentient beings. The bitter disillusionment of his betrayal had nearly destroyed that idealism, but some stubborn kernel of it remained, driving his solitary resistance. Lyra shared fragmented memories of Lycia, a world of perpetual twilight, where bioluminescence was not merely a biological feature, but the foundation of an entire culture. Her people communicated through patterns of light as much as through spoken language, their cities glowing with living architecture that responded to the collective emotional states of their inhabitants. The loss of her connection to that communal light speech had been almost as devastating as the physical torments of her captivity. Sometimes, she confessed one night, as they sat beside the small heating unit that served as both warmth source and cooking station, "I fear I've forgotten how to properly speak with light. That even if I somehow return home, I'd be unable to truly communicate with my own people." In response, Kale surprised her by dimming the sanctuary's overhead lights, casting the room in darkness broken only by the soft glow of her bioluminescent markings. "Show me," he said simply. how you would speak on Lycia. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence, Lyra demonstrated the basics of light speech, controlled pulses and patterns that shifted in intensity, color, and rhythm to convey meaning beyond words. It was a pale shadow of the true complexity of Lycian communication, but the act of sharing this piece of herself, of deliberately using what had been weaponized against her as an expression of identity instead, felt like reclaiming something precious. Cale watched with undisguised fascination, his usually guarded expression open with wonder. "It's beautiful," he said when she finally stopped, embarrassed by his attention. Like watching thoughts take physical form. His genuine appreciation, free from the clinical detachment of her captors or the fearful superstition of Xylos' general population, touched something deep within Lyra. That night, for the first time since her escape, she slept without nightmares. The following morning brought a disruption to their growing routine. Cale's security systems detected unusual movement patterns in the access tunnels near their sanctuary. Multiple figures moving with the coordinated precision that suggested corporate security rather than random scavengers. "They're not searching for us specifically," Cale concluded after reviewing the sensor data. "This looks like a general sweep operation. They do them periodically in different sectors. But if they're thorough, they could find the entrance," Lyra pointed out, studying the surveillance feeds with growing concern. Cale nodded grimly. "We need to go dark. Minimal power usage, no external communications, no exits or entrances until they've moved on." He hesitated, then added, "These sweeps typically last 72 to 96 hours. We have supplies to manage, but it'll be close." The next 4 days became a test of endurance. With most systems powered down to avoid detection, the sanctuary grew cold and dark. They relied on emergency chemical light sticks and Lyra's natural bioluminescence for illumination, huddling together for warmth during sleep cycles. Their water recycler continued to function on minimal power, but food was limited to cold rations, carefully portioned to stretch their supplies. On the third night, as they shared a meager meal in the blue-tinged darkness provided by Lyra's markings, Cale suddenly tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the blaster he kept within reach. "What is it?" Lyra whispered, her own body responding to his alertness. "Listen," Cale replied softly. At first, Lyra heard nothing beyond the faint hum of their drastically reduced life support systems. Then she caught it, a subtle scratching sound coming from somewhere in the ventilation system. It could have been the settling of metal in the perpetually unstable structures of Xylos, but something in its rhythm suggested purpose rather than random noise. Cale moved silently toward the main ventilation access panel, signaling for Lyra to take position on the opposite side of the room. Years of survival had taught them both the value of tactical positioning. Lyra dimmed her bioluminescence to the lowest possible level, plunging the room into near-total darkness. The scratching grew louder, more deliberate. Then came a distinct tapping pattern. 3 quick taps, pause, 2 taps, pause, 3 taps again. Cale's posture changed immediately, tension turning to alert recognition. "It's a contact," he whispered, moving toward the ventilation panel. Friendlies use that knock sequence. Still cautious, he initiated a specific response pattern, tapping against the metal in a complementary rhythm. The scratching paused, then repeated the original pattern with an additional series that Lyra couldn't interpret, but that clearly satisfied Cale. He released the security locks on the panel and carefully slid it open. A small, dirty face appeared in the opening. A child, no more than 10 or 11 standard years, with the gaunt features and prematurely hardened eyes common to Xylos' underprivileged youth. The child's gaze darted around the darkened room, lingering momentarily on Lyra's dimly glowing form before focusing on Cale. "Mr. Ghost," the child whispered, using the name by which Cale was known among certain segments of Xylos' underground network. "Evac needed. Lab breach in Sector 7. 5 runners, 1 critical." Cale's expression tightened. "Security sweeps are active in all surrounding sectors. Little Spark. Routes are compromised." The child, Little Spark, apparently another code name, nodded grimly. "They know. No choice. Doctor says the critical won't last 12 hours without proper medical. Lyra stepped forward, her markings brightening slightly with concern. Who's injured? What type of condition? Little Spark flinched at her approach, eyes widening at the clearer view of her bioluminescent patterns. You're like them, the ones they're looking for. A chill ran through Lyra. There are other Lycians? The child nodded. 4, plus the doctor who helped them escape. He's the critical one. Took a plasma shot to the chest. Kale and Lyra exchanged a significant look. The security sweeps suddenly made more sense. Not routine at all, but a search for escape test subjects. And the fact that a doctor had aided their escape, at great personal risk, suggested someone within the corporate structure had finally found their conscience. Where are they now? Kale asked, already moving to retrieve emergency supplies and weapons from their secure storage. Old processing node in sublevel 9. Temporary shelter only. Doctor masked their biosignatures with some kind of injection, but it's wearing off. Soon the scanners will pick them up. Lyra's mind raced, analyzing the situation through both her scientific knowledge and her hard-won survival instincts. The biosignature masking, that's why they were able to get this far without detection. But once it wears off, the luminescent radiation will be detectable even through barriers. Kale nodded grimly. Just like you were when I found you. Except I had years of accumulated industrial sludge as additional shielding, Lyra pointed out. They won't have that protection. A plan began to form in her mind. Desperate, dangerous, but possibly their only option. I need to reach them, she said with sudden determination. I know how their biology works. I might be able to extend the masking effect, at least long enough to get them somewhere safer. Kale studied her face, recognizing the resolve in her expression. It's not just about helping fellow Lycians, is it? Lyra shook her head. A corporate doctor risked everything to free test subjects. That doesn't happen without a reason. He might have information, what they're really doing in those labs, why they're targeting my people specifically. It's too dangerous, Kale argued, though his tone lacked conviction. Security is everywhere, and you're at even greater risk of detection than I am. Which is why I'll need a disguise, Lyra countered. Not mud this time. Something better. She turned to Little Spark. Can you guide us to them? The child nodded solemnly. That's why I came. Doctor said to find Mr. Ghost if I could. Said you'd help if anyone would. Kale's resistance crumbled in the face of Lyra's determination and the child's trust. We'll need to move fast and stay in the maintenance tunnels as much as possible, he conceded. And we'll need better countermeasures than we've ever used before. Over the next hour, they prepared intensively. Kale modified a series of small EMP devices to temporarily disable security scanners at key junctions. Lyra applied a specially formulated chemical compound to her exposed skin that would partially absorb the radiation from her bioluminescence, reducing their detectability. Both donned the layered, nondescript clothing of maintenance workers, with additional modifications to mask their heat signatures. Before they departed, Kale paused to secure the sanctuary and activate a series of decoy signals that would suggest activity in a different sector, hopefully drawing some of the security forces away from their intended path. As Lyra watched him work, she was struck by the efficiency of his movements, the strategic thinking behind each precaution. You really were special operations, she observed quietly. Kale glanced at her, a hint of his past visible in his bearing. Another lifetime ago, he said simply. Then, with more feeling, be careful out there, Lyra. Xylos has taken enough from both of us already. The journey through Xylos' industrial underbelly was a harrowing exercise in stealth and timing. Little Spark led them through narrow maintenance shafts and abandoned processing tubes that barely accommodated adult bodies. Several times they froze in place as security drones passed nearby, their detection systems sweeping for unauthorized life signs. Each time, Kale's countermeasures or Lyra's chemical masking agent provided just enough concealment to avoid discovery. The physical toll was significant. Lyra's recently recovered strength was tested by the demanding route, while Kale pushed through with the grim determination of someone accustomed to operating beyond normal endurance. Little Spark moved with the uncanny agility of a child who had never known safety, equally at home in vertical shafts and narrow crawl spaces. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of tense movement punctuated by periods of breathless waiting, they arrived at their destination. The old processing node was little more than an abandoned industrial chamber, once used to house automated sorting machinery, but now empty save for the desperate group huddled within. 5 figures were visible in the dim emergency lighting, for were unmistakably Lycian, their natural bioluminescence dimmed to near invisibility but still faintly perceptible to Lyra's attuned vision. They wore the remnants of laboratory garments, their bodies thin and marked with the evidence of medical procedures. The 5th figure lay on an improvised bed of discarded insulation material, a makeshift medical apparatus attached to his chest. This was clearly the doctor, his features drawn with pain despite the sedatives that Little Spark had apparently brought earlier. The Lycians reacted with visible alarm as Kale and Lyra entered the chamber, shrinking back defensively until their eyes registered Lyra's own bioluminescent patterns, partially visible despite the chemical masking agent. Ashit va Maru, Lyra said softly, using the formal greeting of her people. I am Lyra. We've come to help. The oldest of the Lycians, a woman whose once elaborate bioluminescent patterns have been surgically altered into utilitarian strips, stepped forward cautiously. You are free, she asked in heavily accented standard, disbelief evident in her voice. Yes, Lyra confirmed. For some time now, and you will remain free too, if we move quickly. She approached the injured doctor, kneeling beside him to assess his condition. The man's eyes flickered open at her presence, focusing with difficulty. Lycian, he murmured, but not from the lab. No, Lyra confirmed, examining the plasma wound with practiced efficiency. I escaped years ago. Your young messenger found us through mutual contact. The doctor nodded weakly. Had to get them out. Couldn't stand it anymore. The new protocols. Inhuman. Kale joined them, his expression grave as he evaluated the doctor's injury. That's a core hit, he said quietly to Lyra, even with proper medical facilities. I know, Lyra responded, equally hushed. To the doctor, she asked, what's your name? Ellister, he managed. Dr. Tomas Ellister. Geneticist. Dr. Ellister, Lyra said gently, you've been very brave, but we need to move everyone to safety, and your injury is fatal. Ellister finished for her, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I know. Military-grade plasma. No coming back from that without a full medical bay, which we obviously don't have here. He drew a labored breath. But before you move them, you need to know. The data chip in my breast pocket. Everything's there. What they're doing. Why? All of it. With trembling fingers, he extracted a small, encrypted data storage device from his pocket. This is worth more than my life. Worth more than all our lives? Maybe. He pressed it into Lyra's hand. The Lycian genome. They found something. Something they think they can weaponize. That's why the experiments. Why the abductions. Lyra's markings pulsed with distress as she accepted the chip. What do they find? What could possibly justify? Genetic memory. Ellister interrupted, his voice fading. Your people. You carry ancestral memories in your DNA. Not just instinct, but actual experiences. Knowledge. They're trying to extract it to access information about ancient technologies your ancestors might have encountered. Weapons. Power sources. Things that could shift the balance of corporate power. The revelation struck Lyra like a physical blow. Genetic memory was a controversial theory among Lycian scientists, one she had never given much credence to despite the occasional inexplicable dreams and impressions that many Lycians reported. The idea that corporations were torturing her people to extract historical knowledge buried in their very cells was horrifying on multiple levels. The masking agent I developed, Ellister continued, gesturing weakly toward a small case beside him. It works by temporarily suppressing the unique aspects of Lycian cellular energy production. 3 more doses there, enough to get them out of the detection zone if you move fast. Kale, who had been monitoring the chamber's access points while they spoke, rejoined them. We need to move soon, he warned. Security patterns are shifting. They're expanding the search perimeter. Ellister gripped Lyra's wrist with surprising strength. Promise me, he insisted. Get them to safety, and get that data to someone who can use it. The Federation Science Council, maybe someone outside corporate influence. I promise, Lyra said, covering his hand with her own. Your sacrifice won't be wasted. A look of peace settled over Ellister's features. I've done terrible things, he whispered. Told myself it was just research, just following orders. This doesn't balance the scales, but he trailed off, his gaze becoming unfocused. It matters, Lyra assured him, recognizing the universal need for absolution. What you did today matters. Ellister nodded faintly, then closed his eyes. His breathing continued, shallow and labored, but his consciousness had retreated. Cale touched Lyra's shoulder gently. We can't take him with us, he said softly. Not with that injury. I know, Lyra acknowledged, a familiar grief settling in her chest. He knew it too. She turned to the waiting Lycians, switching to their native language for privacy and comfort. We must prepare to move. The doctor has given us temporary protection from detection, but it won't last. I'll explain everything once we're safer. The next hour passed in a blur of careful preparation. Lyra administered Ellister's masking agent to the 4 Lycians, while Cale planned their return route, accounting for the shifting security patterns. Before they departed, Lyra knelt once more beside Ellister, whose breathing had grown increasingly erratic. Rest now, she told him, though she wasn't sure he could hear her. You've done enough. As they prepared to leave, the oldest Lycian woman placed her hand on Ellister's forehead in a traditional gesture of blessing. The doctor's expression relaxed slightly at the touch, though he didn't regain consciousness. The journey back was even more perilous than the approach. The expanded security presence forced them to take longer, more convoluted routes. The 4 rescued Lycians, weakened by captivity and experimentation, struggled with the physical demands of the escape, requiring frequent rest periods that increased their risk of detection. Twice they nearly encountered security patrols, saved only by Cale's intimate knowledge of Xylos' surveillance blind spots and Little Spark's uncanny ability to sense approaching danger before it arrived. By the time they finally reached the sanctuary, all of them were exhausted beyond measure, running on nothing but raw determination and fear. Once inside, with the entrance secure behind them, Lyra collapsed against the wall, the adrenaline that had sustained her suddenly evaporating. Beside her, Cale looked equally drained, the lines in his face deepened by fatigue and stress. The rescued Lycians huddled together in the center of the main chamber, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope as they took in their surroundings. We made it, Lyra breathed, the reality of their success only now beginning to register. Cale nodded, a hint of grim satisfaction showing through his exhaustion. For now, but this changes everything. The sanctuary wasn't designed to support this many people, and security will be looking everywhere after an escape of this magnitude. Lyra's hand went to the data chip in her pocket, Ellister's final gift and burden. We need to examine what's on this. If what he told me is true, it could explain why my people have been targeted for generations. Over the next several days, a new reality established itself. The sanctuary, once spacious for 2 people, became crowded but functional for 7. Supplies were carefully rationed, sleeping arrangements improvised, and security protocols intensified. Little Spark, with no family to return to, remained with them, quickly proving valuable for information gathering and small-scale supply runs that adults couldn't risk. The 4 rescued Lycians, Nera, the older woman who had spoken first, Talon, a young male barely into adulthood, and twin sisters Ciri and Mira, perhaps 16 in standard years, gradually revealed their stories. All had been abducted from different locations over the past 2 years, brought to Xylos specifically for the experimental program Dr. Ellister had described. Their experiences in the labs had left both physical and psychological scars that would require long healing. Cale and Lyra took turns analyzing the data chip, which contained thousands of research files, security footage, and a lister's personal notes. The information confirmed his dying words. Corporations across the galaxy had been secretly hunting Lycians for generations, driven by the discovery that their unique genetic structure contained measurable traces of ancestral memories, stretching back thousands of years. "Listen to this," Lyra said one night, reading from a lister's personal logs. Subject 27 under deep neurochemical induction revealed coherent technical specifications for what appears to be an ancient energy containment system, far beyond current Federation technology. Subject had no prior engineering training or knowledge. Subsequent attempts to replicate the results with other subjects have yielded similar but fragmentary information, suggesting the memories may be distributed across bloodlines rather than universally accessible. Kale's expression darkened as he absorbed the implications. "They're treating your people like organic data storage, trying to extract technical information your ancestors might have possessed. That's why they've been specifically targeting researchers and academics," Lyra realized, connecting pieces of information from multiple files. "Not just because we're easier to isolate and abduct, but because higher cognitive training might make the extracted memories more accessible or coherent." The data painted a disturbing picture of corporate competition to exploit Lycian genetic memory, with different companies specializing in different extraction techniques. Some focused on neurochemical methods, others on direct cellular sampling, and the most aggressive on experimental procedures that often proved fatal to the subjects. It was a scientific atrocity on a scale that even Lyra, who had experienced it firsthand, found difficult to comprehend. This information could shake the entire Federation if released properly, Kale noted, studying a corporate communication that explicitly acknowledged the illegal nature of their research. Multiple violations of sentient rights protocols, illegal experimentation, corporate conspiracy. It's enough to trigger interventions, even with the level of corruption we know exists. "But how do we release it?" Lyra questioned. "We're trapped on Xylos, and any transmission powerful enough to reach Federation space would be detected and blocked immediately." This question became the focus of their planning over the following weeks. As they debated options, life in the sanctuary fell into new patterns. The younger Lycians began to recover their strength, assisted by Lyra's knowledge of their specific biological needs. Nera, who had been a cultural historian before her abduction, worked with Lyra to help the others process their trauma through traditional Lycian meditation and light speech practices. Little Spark proved to be an avid learner, absorbing technical skills from Kale and biological information from Lyra with equal enthusiasm. A month after the rescue, their precarious stability was shattered by an urgent alert from one of Kale's long-range sensors. A Federation diplomatic vessel had entered Xylos' orbit, an exceedingly rare occurrence given the planet's status as a corporate-controlled world with minimal Federation oversight. "This could be our chance," Kale said, studying the vessel's profile on his monitoring system. A diplomatic ship would have secure communications that could bypass corporate controls. "If we could somehow get the data to them, or get ourselves to them," Lyra suggested, a dangerous hope kindling within her. A Federation vessel would be obligated to provide asylum to refugees with evidence of corporate crimes. The challenge seemed nearly insurmountable. Reaching the spaceport from their hidden location without detection, somehow gaining access to the diplomatic vessel, and all while protecting for traumatized Lycians and a street child. Yet the opportunity was too significant to ignore. After intense discussion, they developed a desperate plan. Kale would use his remaining contacts to arrange transportation to the spaceport district under the guise of a maintenance crew. Little Spark's knowledge of the service tunnels would help them bypass the most heavily secured checkpoints. Once near the spaceport, they would need to create a distraction significant enough to draw security forces away from the diplomatic docking bay long enough for them to make contact with Federation personnel. "It's a terrible plan," Kale acknowledged grimly. "Too many variables, too many points of potential failure. But it's the only one we have," Lyra responded, her determination mirrored in the steady glow of her markings. "We can't stay hidden forever, not with a lister's information. We owe it to him, to these survivors, to all the Lycians who didn't survive the labs. The preparation consumed another week. Kale called in every favor, exhausted every resource, and prepared fallback options for each stage of the plan. Lyra worked with the other Lycians, helping them regain enough strength for the journey and teaching them techniques to minimize their bioluminescent signatures. Little Spark memorized every access code and maintenance schedule that might affect their route. The night before their planned departure, Lyra found Kale sitting alone in the small alcove that had served as his private space before the sanctuary had become so crowded. He was methodically checking and rechecking his weapons, his expression distant. "Second thoughts?" she asked softly, settling beside him. Kale shook his head. "Just preparing. Old habits." He set aside the blaster he'd been calibrating. 6 years on this hellhole, hiding, helping when I could, but mostly just surviving. Tomorrow we either break free or we don't. Lyra finished when he trailed off. "I know." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of tomorrow's risk hanging between them. "Lyra," Kale finally said, turning to face her directly. "If we make it off Xylos, when we make it off," he corrected himself, "what then? For you, I mean." The question caught her off guard. In all their planning, she had focused entirely on the immediate goal of escape, of getting Alistair's information to the proper authorities. The concept of a future beyond that point seemed almost too fragile to contemplate. "I don't know," she admitted. "Help the others find their families, if possible. Make sure the Federation acts on Alistair's evidence." She hesitated, then added softly, "I'm not sure I know how to live a normal life anymore, or if such a thing even exists for me after everything that's happened." Kale nodded in understanding. 6 years ago, when I went to ground on Xylos, I thought my life was over, that survival was all I had left. Then you showed up, covered in mud and more determined to live than anyone I'd ever met. His hand found hers in the dim light. "Whatever comes next, I'd like to face it with you, if you want that." The simple declaration, so contrary to Xylos' culture of isolation and self-preservation, struck Lyra with unexpected force. Her markings brightened involuntarily, illuminating their small corner with gentle blue light that reflected the emotion she couldn't fully voice. "I'd like that too," she said, her fingers interlacing with his. "Whatever comes next." The moment was interrupted by Little Spark's appearance at the alcove entrance. Final transport arrangements confirmed. The child reported with the efficiency that had become characteristic. "Our window opens at 0400 hours. Kale acknowledged the information with a nod, reluctantly releasing Lyra's hand to return to his preparations. The brief moment of connection and future possibility was set aside, not forgotten, but carefully preserved for a time when such thoughts might be more than dangerous distractions. The morning arrived with Xylos' perpetual smog turning the dawn into little more than a marginal lightening of the rusty darkness. They moved out in carefully planned stages, leaving the sanctuary that had been Kale's home for 6 years and Lyra's refuge for months. None of them spoke of the possibility that they might never return. Such sentimentality was a luxury that survival on Xylos didn't permit. Their journey through the industrial labyrinth proceeded according to plan until they reached the outer transit hub that would take them to the spaceport district. There, they encountered the first major obstacle, a surprising increase in security presence, with additional scanners and checkpoints that hadn't been reported by Kale's contacts. "Something's wrong," Kale muttered, observing from a concealed position. "This isn't standard protocol, even for a diplomatic visit." Little Spark, who had scouted ahead, rejoined them with a concerned expression. Overheard guards talking. Federation officials conducting surprise inspection of research facilities. Corporate execs in panic mode. Lyra and Kale exchanged meaningful glances. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Someone else had raised concerns about the activities occurring in Xylos' labs. This could work to their advantage or create additional complications. Change of plan, Kale decided after brief consideration. If Federation officials are inspecting facilities, they'll have groundside transport, smaller, less guarded than the main vessel. We go for the inspection team instead of the ship, Lyra concluded, quickly understanding his reasoning. The revised plan required real-time adjustments as they moved through the increasingly alert security zones of Xylos. Using Little Spark's intelligence and Kale's tactical experience, they managed to identify the location where the Federation inspection team was scheduled to visit next, a supposedly legitimate research facility that, according to Alistair's data, housed some of the most aggressive experimentation programs. Positioning themselves along the expected route, they prepared to intercept the Federation transport. The risk was enormous. Direct contact with Federation officials in plain view of corporate security could result in immediate firefight, but the potential reward of bypassing the heavily guarded spaceport made it worth attempting. When the Federation transport finally appeared, escorted by corporate security vehicles, Kale made a split-second assessment. Too many guards, too exposed, he concluded grimly. We need to follow them to the facility, find a moment when the officials are separated from their corporate escorts. Hours of tense surveillance followed as they shadowed the inspection team from a distance. The facility itself was a gleaming structure of polished metal and glass, presenting a facade of legitimate scientific endeavor that belied the horrors Alistair had documented within. Watching it from their hiding place, Lyra felt physically ill, knowing what had occurred behind those walls. "There," Kale suddenly whispered, indicating a small side entrance where a portion of the Federation team was exiting, apparently having split from the main group. 3 officials, minimal corporate presence. It was now or never. Abandoning stealth for speed, they approached the Federation representatives directly. The officials, 2 humans and a Virgilian, reacted with alarm as the unusual group converged on them, corporate security guards reaching for weapons. "Federation Asylum," Lyra called out clearly, stepping forward with her hands raised, deliberately allowing her bioluminescent patterns to become fully visible. "We have evidence of corporate crimes against sentient beings and request immediate protection under Statute 27 of the Sentient Rights Accord." The invocation of a specific legal protocol caused the lead Federation official, a stern-faced woman with commander insignia, to signal her guards to hold. "Identify yourselves," she demanded, her gaze moving from Lyra to the other Lycians and back. "I am Lyra, xenobiologist from Lycia Prime, abducted while conducting legitimate research. These are fellow Lycians rescued from illegal experimentation facilities on Xylos." She held out the data chip. "This contains comprehensive evidence of corporate atrocities, compiled by a corporate doctor who died helping us escape." The commander's expression remained professionally neutral, but her eyes betrayed recognition at the mention of Lycian abductions. "How do I know this isn't a corporate ploy to undermine our inspection?" she asked, though her body language had shifted subtly, placing herself between the group and the increasingly agitated corporate representatives. "You know by these," Lyra responded, gesturing to the distinctive bioluminescent patterns visible on all 5 Lycians, patterns that could not be artificially replicated with current technology. "And by the fact that we risked everything to reach you with this information." A tense standoff ensued as the commander assessed the situation, clearly weighing diplomatic protocols against the unexpected asylum request. The corporate security forces had been joined by additional guards from inside the facility, creating a potentially volatile situation. Just as the balance seemed to be tipping toward intervention by corporate forces, the commander made her decision. With a subtle hand signal to her own security team, she stepped forward and accepted the data chip from Lyra. "By authority of Federation Diplomatic Protocol 355, I hereby extend provisional protection to these individuals pending investigation of their claims," she announced formally, her voice carrying the weight of Federation law that even Xylos' corporate masters couldn't openly defy. "They will accompany us back to our vessel immediately." The corporate representatives erupted in objections, citing jurisdiction limitations and questioning the commander's authority. She weathered the protests with practiced diplomacy while her security team efficiently escorted Lyra, Kale, and the others into the Federation transport vehicle. As the doors sealed behind them, isolating them from the corporate representatives for the first time, The reality of what had just occurred began to sink in. They had done it. They had escaped Xylos' clutches and placed Alistair's evidence in Federation hands. The commander, watching them with a measured gaze, spoke quietly. "I am Commander Vashikori. Our inspection was initiated based on anonymous information about possible violations of Federation research protocols. I suspect we've just met the source of that information's liberators." Lyra and Kale exchanged glances, understanding immediately. Alistair must have sent some portion of his findings to Federation authorities before orchestrating the escape, perhaps as insurance in case they didn't survive to deliver the complete data. As the transport lifted off, heading for the Federation vessel in orbit, Lyra found herself pressed against the viewport, watching Xylos' toxic landscape recede beneath them. The rusty haze that had been her prison sky for so long gradually gave way to the clear blackness of space, punctuated by stars that had seemed like impossible dreams during her years of captivity. Beside her, Kale stood in silent witness to the moment, his hand finding hers as it had the night before. Neither spoke. Words were insufficient for the complex emotions of the moment. Relief, disbelief, grief for those left behind, uncertainty about what lay ahead. The other Lycians had gathered around them, their bioluminescent patterns spontaneously synchronizing in a traditional expression of collective emotion that transcended individual experience. Even Little Spark, dazzled by the viewport display and the prospect of leaving Xylos forever, seemed to understand the significance of the moment, standing respectfully silent amid the glowing tableau. As the Federation vessel grew visible against the starfield, a sleek embodiment of the civilization and justice they had nearly lost faith in, Lyra found herself thinking of Dr. Alistair's final words. "This doesn't balance the scales," he had said of his sacrifice. Perhaps nothing could fully balance the scales of what had been done to her people, to herself. But as she stood surrounded by survivors, clutching the hand of the man who had seen her humanity beneath layers of mud and fear, she felt something that had been absent for longer than she could remember. Possibility. Whatever came next, the investigations, the revelations, the long process of healing, they would face it together, no longer merely surviving but beginning to reclaim life on their own terms. Lyra turned from the viewport to meet Kale's gaze, a small smile forming on her lips. In the reflected light of her bioluminescence, she could see the same renewed hope mirrored in his eyes, the promise of a future neither of them had dared imagine during their time on Xylos. As the Federation vessel's docking bay opened to receive them, Lyra squeezed Kale's hand. "I remember something my people say when embarking on a journey," she said softly. "Xavier Marincalit. The horizon is not an ending, but a beginning." Kale's smile deepened, the hardened lines of his face softening in ways that made him look years younger. "I like that," he replied. "Horizons, not endings." Little Spark, overhearing them, looked up with uncharacteristic wonder. "What's a real horizon look like? Without all the smoke and factories?" "You'll see soon," Lyra promised, resting her free hand on the child's shoulder. "We'll all see it together." The transport settled gently into the docking bay of the Federation vessel. As the airlock cycled and the doors prepared to open onto their new reality, Lyra took a deep breath, the last she would ever take of Xylos' recycled industrial air. When she exhaled, she released with it some measure of the fear and pain that had defined her existence for so long. The doors slid open, revealing the clean, orderly interior of the Federation ship and a medical team waiting to receive them. Light years away from Xylos' perpetual twilight, it was a fitting threshold between past and future, between mere survival and the possibility of truly living again. Step by step, they moved forward together, leaving behind the mud and darkness, walking toward whatever horizon awaited them among stars.